Here we are in Florida, a place that we always said we would never live. Never say never, folks, because when you make plans, the universe laughs. And that's not always true, but many times. And so we are not in Tennessee as we intended. We hope to be there at some point. But here we are in Florida, and we are um, sharing a home with my son and daughter-in-law and our a little over 1 year old grandson Leonidas. And so we're very happy with that. It's a joy to be here. But Florida is well, first of all, it's hot. I don't know what the temperature is up there today, but it's going to be in the low 90s today here. And we haven't had rain in weeks, so it's a little tough. But one of the things that Florida does have are some of the best places for swimming and for scuba diving. Now, have any of you ever gone scuba diving? I don't know. I've never gone scuba diving. Michael has. I've never gone scuba diving, and actually I can't any longer. They don't recommend it for someone with a heart condition like I have. So I haven't gone scuba diving. I've gone snorkeling. When Lisa and I were on our honeymoon years ago, 36 years ago now, in Barbados, we went out on this boat, and down there the water goes out. You can see the bottom for a mile out or 2 miles out. And I snorkeled down and got to see all the brain coral and had a school of clownfish swim around me. And Lisa, however, stood on the end of the boat and peeked in and said, "Okay, that's enough for me." And she didn't bother to do that. I think the brain coral scared her. But that's all I've done. But Florida has some great places for scuba. Oh, and you know what we have not about a mile from us? We have Weeki Wachee. Do you remember Weeki Wachee, the advertisements where they have the mermaids, the alleged mermaids, the women swimming underneath in their costumes, and they're breathing underwater because they have tubes that they can take their oxygen. It's a lot of fun, I guess. I haven't been there, but we have Weeki Wachee, so we have real mermaids in Florida. But it does have some great places to go scuba diving. And I was reminded recently of a science fiction movie that I love. Now, I like science fiction movies, but I especially love the ones where they're making contact with aliens. And one of my favorites is the 1989 movie The Abyss, starring Ed Harris and Elizabeth Mastrantonio. Do you remember that movie? It's kind of a complicated plot about a submarine that has sunk to the bottom of the Cayman Trough, which is the deepest point in the Caribbean. And through plots and twists and turns involving a crazed soldier and a nuclear warhead that he's stolen, it's sunk into the trench, and Ed Harris has to don a special suit to go down into this trench deeper than anyone has ever dived before. And this suit gets filled up with a special kind of liquid that allows him to breathe underwater. And he goes down to disarm this nuclear warhead. And let's put it this way, he gets a little more than he bargained for. And if you've never seen the movie, I recommend it. It's a fun movie. And my point in bringing it up is really just that he needs a special suit to dive so deeply. He can only go so deep without the proper gear and instruction, just like any scuba diver, right? And at the same time, that's true of our spiritual lives. We need the right instruction, we need the right gear, and the right instructors if we want to explore the depths of the spirit, if we're not content to live on the spiritual surface and just snorkel about up there. Carl Jung said that water is a symbol of the unconscious, a symbol of the spirit. If you've ever had a dream of swimming in the ocean or diving or even fishing in a river or an ocean, you're being called by your subconscious to explore something deep in your subconscious and in the spirit. Water has always played a role in spiritual life. Jesus said famously, unless you are born of water and spirit, you can't see the kingdom of heaven. Buddha said that we're like drops of water in the ocean, and yet we are the ocean. And if you know the story of Guru Nanak, the founder of the Sikh tradition, the story is that he had been meditating and looking for the truth. And at one point, he had meditated so deeply that he wandered into the Ganges River and wandered out and went to the bottom and stayed there for 3 days and then came out. And when he came out, he said, there is no Hindu and there is no Muslim. So today, I want to just take a dive with Jesus and the Buddha by looking at a part of the Gospel of Thomas. Now, you remember the Gospel of Thomas, if you recall anything I ever said over those 10 years, you remember that the Gospel of Thomas is one of those Gnostic texts. It's a collection of wisdom sayings of Jesus, in which he instructs his followers in a new way of living. And the sayings are supposed to be a means of transformation for someone's life, the hearer or the reader today. And Thomas is a part of a long tradition of wisdom texts. There are different collections, including the Book of Proverbs, which is a wisdom text, Ecclesiastes, the Wisdom of Solomon in the Catholic version of the Bible. In the Jewish tradition, there's the Sayings of the Fathers, which is included in the Mishnah, at the portion of the Talmud, the first portion. And then there's later on, there are other texts that were written over the centuries, the Philokalia, which was written by the Desert Fathers, and very fascinating books. And the text of the Gospel of Thomas exists in its entirety only in a Coptic version that was found with the Nag Hammadi library. You remember those texts that had been buried in the 4th century. Now, scholars have disagreements over whether or not Thomas is strictly a Gnostic text or not, because there's no narrative in there as there are in other Gnostic texts or even in the gospel. There's no story about the birth of Jesus or the death and resurrection. There's no story about him healing anyone or turning water into wine. It's just 114 sayings of Jesus. And some scholars say it's not really a Gnostic text. They think it's just a wisdom text. I'm on the side that says it is a Gnostic text. And there are others, like Harold Bloom, who was an American literary critic and who was a professor at Yale. And he says that he believes that Thomas is a completely Gnostic work. He says in Thomas, he finds a Jesus who is a great verbal artist, one who can tell a great story and piece together things so that people understand in that oral tradition that he was part of. He says that Jesus is more of a teacher than a savior. And he says nothing mediates the self for Jesus in the Gospel of Thomas. In other words, there's no intermediary between the self and the divine. Everything we seek, as Jesus said in that verse I read before, is already in our presence. It's inside us and it's outside of us. And what's most remarkable in these sayings is the repeated instance that everything is already open to us. All we have to do is knock and enter. Bloom says the emphasis of this Jesus is upon a pervasive opacity that prevents us from seeing anything that really matters. Ignorance is the blocking agent, he says. And we'll talk a little more about that later on. But this is the Jesus that I've grown fond of and come to appreciate over the years now as I read and study that text and the other Gnostic texts as well. Probably because I'm more interested in questions than I am in answers. I mean, what good are the answers if you're not asking the right questions, right? And these texts bring up questions. Parables and sayings were the way that Jesus taught. We're all familiar with the parables in the Christian scriptures, or at least somewhat familiar with them. We've heard them here or there. In the canonical Gospels, Jesus often starts something by saying, the kingdom of God, or the kingdom of heaven, or the kingdom of righteousness is like, and then he goes on to tell a parable. He has the parable of the mustard seed, the parable of the prodigal son, all those the Good Samaritan. We're familiar with those, even if we're not a Christian. We've heard them. It's a cultural thing. And Thomas has no narrative, I said before. And a lot of his sayings in the Gospel of Thomas are like Zen koans. Now, you remember a koan is a question to be wrestled with and thought about for a long time, rather than a simply metaphorical or allegorical interpretation like the one that have been handed down to us over the years in the Christian tradition for those parables. And I'm reminded of Rilke's poem or his quote, and you're familiar with this, that he said in Letters to a Young Poet. He says, "You are so young, so much before all beginning, and I would like to beg you, dear sir, as well as I can, to have patience with everything unresolved in your heart, and try to love the questions themselves, as if they were locked rooms or books written in a very foreign language. Don't search for the answers, which could not be given to you now, because you would not be able to live them. And the point is to live everything. Live the questions now. Perhaps then some day, far in the future, you will gradually, without even noticing it, live your way into the answer." Now that sounds more like a Buddhist perspective to me than a Christian one. So we're ready to dive a little deeper here, right? And we're talking about these parables, and I wanted to read you one that only appears in the Gospel of Thomas. It doesn't appear in any of the canonical Gospels. And in fact, the only Gospel in the New Testament that doesn't have any parables at all is the Gospel of John. But Matthew, Mark, and Luke do. So in this particular parable in the Gospel of Thomas, it goes like this. Jesus said, "The kingdom of heaven is like a certain woman who was carrying a jar full of grain. When she was walking on the road, still some distance from home, one of the handles of the jar broke, and the grain emptied out behind her on the road, but she didn't realize it. When she reached her house, she set the jar down and found it empty." Now there's more, right? That's what you're thinking, because that's what I was thinking when I first read this too. But there's not. That's where it ends, and it moves on to another parable and another saying. And that's what we find throughout the Gospel of Thomas. These short, pithy sayings and parables that are left without any commentary. And that's what I believe makes the Gospel of Thomas so appealing to me and to other people. Why so many Christian traditions, especially those in authority, don't like it and they reject it. Traditional parables that most of us, or many of us here, grew up with have been explained to us over the years. I mentioned the parable of the Good Samaritan or the mustard seed, and we know those interpretations, and they've been handed down to us as the correct ones. These are the correct interpretations. And to question them, at least, is thought to be naive or uninformed, or even worse, you might be considered a kind of a heretic if you question them. Kind of like me. It's possible that just like this parable in Thomas, many of those parables that we grew up with were originally left without any commentary in the original text. Scholars believe that some of those commentaries were added on later on. And remember, those Gospels weren't written down until like 40, 50, 60, 70 years later after Jesus' death. If you remember, you know that Jesus tells a parable, and either in response to one of his disciples or a question posed to him, he'll say, "Well, what I mean by that is this." And those explanations have not always been in the original texts that were found. Now, think about how those parables might have been told in those early Christian communities, right? And then after hearing them, someone asked the person telling it, not Jesus, remember, it's being passed on orally, "Well, what does that mean?" And so a discussion happens. Over the years, commentary gets added. And what do we have there? We've spoken about this before. We have Midrash. Remember, this is still a Jewish community mostly. The Gentiles were added later on when Paul became a Christian. But this is still a Jewish community, and it's engaged in making those texts living for them at that time and applicable at that time. And so I want to look at that parable again and consider it from a different angle. To me, this parable and the other ones, as I said, are like Zen koans. In the Buddhist tradition, a Zen koan is a statement that a master gives to a disciple or a student, and they tell him, now go and think about this for a while. And a while can be a week, it can be a month, it can be a year, it can be 10 years that they have to wrestle with these statements, these koans. And you all know a couple of koans, at least you know a famous one. You know the one that says, what is the sound of one hand clapping? That's a Zen koan. And actually, Hakuin Ikaku, a Zen master who originally said it, stated it as two hands clap. What is the sound of one hand? But we shortened it to, what is the sound of one hand clapping? There's another one that says, does a dog have Buddha nature? The answer is easy, right? There is no sound. Of course, no, a dog having Buddha nature. And if you were to tell that to a Zen master, they would send you away again and say, go think about this some more until you get the right answer. And the same is true, I think, with these parables in Thomas. Now, it does exist that the possibility is that Thomas had some Buddhist influence, because it's believed, at least traditionally and in legend, that Thomas is the disciple that traveled to South India to bring Christianity there, or at least his version of Christianity there. And he went to South India, to Tamil Nadu and Kerala and the Malabar coast. Elaine Pagels, who's a Gnostic scholar, in her book, The Gnostic Gospels, says that the living Jesus of the Nag Hammadi texts speaks of illusion and enlightenment, not sin and repentance. Instead of coming to save us from sin, he comes as a guide who opens access to spiritual understanding. But when the disciple attains enlightenment, Jesus no longer serves as his spiritual master. The two have become equal, even identical. Jesus said in the Gospel of Thomas, I am not your master because you have drunk. You have become drunk from the bubbling stream which I have measured out. He who will drink from my mouth will become as I am. I myself shall become he, and the things that are hidden will be revealed to him. Now, how does one drink from his mouth? He's saying there, the words I speak, you drink them metaphorically through your ears. Think about it. You hear the people who are hearing him, and today the people who read those words. That's how they become drunk on and enlightened on his words. And that's very similar to the Buddha telling his disciples in his last sermon to be lamps unto themselves, that they will become like him. They already are, in fact, Buddhas. Remember that saying? The finger pointing at the moon is not the moon. So let's take a look at this parable. Let's look at the story as it's given. A woman is carrying a jug of grain, and one of the handles break, and she continues to walk and not realizing that the grain is being poured out and she's losing it. And then she sets it down and realizes, oh, it's empty. And Jesus says in Thomas, the kingdom of heaven is like this. And then he tells that parable. But then we have to wrestle with this. And let's consider that backstory of that woman. Let's do some midrash of our own. So this is how I would explain it. And this is only my interpretation. It's not necessarily one you would take from it, but let me tell you how I look at that. Imagine I'm Jesus and I'm going to tell you a story. I know it's a stretch, but imagine that. Once upon a time, there was a woman, just an ordinary woman who happened to live in a very small village that had no marketplace of its own. And at the harvest season, the crops having been gathered in, she decided to walk to a larger village, a few miles away, where she could sell her grain and buy the things that she needed. So she starts off early in the morning, and she brought some things that her family had grown, and she brought along a large pottery jar with two big handles. And she arrives at the marketplace and sells everything she has, and she purchases some things she needs, including some grain, and she puts the grain in a jar. And as she's walking along, one of the handles breaks, and she doesn't think anything of it. She just takes it by the other handle and keeps walking. But maybe the broken handle left a crack in the jar, or maybe when the jar hit the ground, there was a little hole that was made in the bottom of the jar. Who knows? She might not even notice it. So she's probably not just paying attention to because she's dealing with the heat of the day and she just needs to get home. She has a long way to walk. And bit by bit, that grain starts to come out of the jug. You know how that is, right? Have you ever gone to the grocery store and you bought like some beans or something like that, and the bag breaks and you realize, oh, or worse, you have a bottle in the bag, the plastic bag, and it's too heavy and it breaks, and there goes your milk or whatever you have in the bottle, right? So she gets home and she finds that the jug is empty, and Jesus says that's what the kingdom of heaven is like. Well, what does that mean? First of all, what is the fact that he starts out by saying a certain woman? It's like the kingdom of heaven is like a woman, he says. We wrestle with that. Some people say, oh, that's a sexist statement. No, I don't think so. I mean, culturally, it was just that that's what a woman would have been doing back in those days. She's the one who took care of the house. She's the one who did all the market work and all that stuff, not the husband, not the men of the household. But then what we really have to think about isn't so much the woman, but the jug. It was probably made by a local potter, probably just a clay pot for everyday use, and she's carrying it. But if the handle broke and grain started pouring out, why didn't she notice? Didn't she notice it was getting lighter? So maybe some things are interesting here for us to consider. Jesus probably wasn't emphasizing that the kingdom of heaven, or as we like to call it, I prefer to call it his beloved community, is like the woman. He wasn't saying that. Maybe his point was about the jug itself. And if the writer of Thomas had some contact with Buddhism, his point was actually about an empty jug, about emptiness. Perhaps he was trying to say that the kingdom of heaven requires us to be broken in some way so that we can become empty of our ego, of all the things that keep us from experiencing our true nature as members of the beloved community, or to put it in Buddhist terms, of experiencing our Buddha nature. Perhaps we have to think of ourselves as that woman carrying a jug full of grain or whatever it is we're carrying that weighs us down. And when we find our jug broken, or when we find ourselves broken, we realize that we have to keep walking toward home. Maybe we don't even notice our brokenness. But then one day, we come to a place where we do notice it and we recognize it. We say that our brokenness has brought us to a place of emptiness. Not the kind of emptiness that's depressing, but the kind of emptiness that allows us to see that letting go of things we were attached to, the things that weigh us down, that have gradually been set aside now. And now we can appreciate the lightness that emptiness gives us and the space it affords us to use. Remember that reading that I gave from the Tao Te Ching? It's the space inside the jug that we use, the emptiness inside the jug. It's the space inside the house that we use, the empty space. Once we start looking, we find that images of emptiness and nothingness appear all through the Christian scriptures. If you think of the story of the rich young man, maybe you're familiar with the story. A rich young man comes to Jesus and he says, I want to follow you. And he says, Jesus says, you have to follow the commandments. Make sure you follow all the commandments. And the rich young man says, I've observed all the commandments ever since I was a child. And then Jesus says to him, that's great, good. Now go and sell all that you have, sell everything, and give the money to the poor, and you will have laid up treasure for yourself in heaven. Then come follow me. And if you know the story, it says that the rich young man went away sad because he couldn't do it. He was still full Not so much of money and everything, but full of himself. Or there's the passage in the Sermon on the Mount where Jesus says we shouldn't worry so much about material things. We shouldn't even worry about clothing, he says. He says, why do you worry about clothing? Think about the lilies of the field, how they grow. They don't toil or spin, but I tell you that even Solomon in all of his glory was not clothed like one of these. Jesus even empties out his family in one instance where he says to his disciples, well, they say to him, your sisters and your brothers and your mother have come here to see you. And he says, who are my mother? And who are my brothers and sisters? Whoever does the will of God is my brother and my sister and my mother. He has a way of talking about emptiness that's different from the Buddhist and Taoist traditions. The teachings of Jesus are more likely to advise us to pay less attention to material things. The Buddhist tradition instructs us to try to empty our minds and ourselves as a form of spiritual practice. But in both of them, we seem to find an idea that in order for us to be connected with that which is most important in life, we have to empty our lives of non-essential things as best we can. We even have to empty our lives of things we thought were essential, but which are really not. Because emptiness is all about possibility. Have you ever bought or received a new empty journal to write in? I've got 5 or 6 of them up on the shelf. They're still all empty because I don't journal. I'm terrible at that kind of thing. But they're there. That's emptiness. And it's possibility that you can write something in that journal. Remember Etch-a-Sketch? When you were a kid, you had an Etch-a-Sketch. And you take that thing, you draw something, and then you shake it and it's empty. There's possibility right there. We just got done in the Christian tradition, people got done celebrating Easter and the resurrection. The idea, whether you believe it literally or not, of the resurrection and the empty tomb is emptiness that leads to possibility. Had the story simply left Jesus in the tomb and the women had found his body there on the first Easter morning, what possibility would there have been? Both Jesus and Lao Tzu talk about the way. They don't talk about the place that we're going to get to eventually. In fact, the early followers of Jesus were called followers of the way. They weren't called Christians until a while later down the road at a place called Antioch. They talk about the way, the path, the journey. And we see that in the parable of the empty jar. Jesus says that the empty jar is like the kingdom of heaven. But he also tells us that the process by which the jar becomes empty, first the handle of the jar has to be broken, and then it empties out over time. Then the woman gets home and realizes that her jug is empty because of brokenness. And then what's going to happen? She's going to be shocked, right? She's going to say, oh, I've lost all that grain. And what is she going to have to do with that emptiness? She's going to have to rely on beloved community. She's going to have to rely on her friends and her family. Maybe she'll have to get some flour from them. Maybe they'll have to help her go back to the market and get a different jug and go get some more flour. So that's a long way from the original parable. That's my understanding of it. Now, you may read that parable and think of it in a different way, and that's what it's all about. But the process of thinking of that parable is how we get something out of it, to wrestle with those words. By looking into the empty jar, by looking into emptiness, we come face to face with reality that doesn't have to have firm and final answers. A reality that's always changing, that's always a process. Our lives are always a process. So what happened after Jesus told this parable? The gospel doesn't say. Maybe like he did in other gospels that we read, that he explained it or he didn't explain it, and he just got into a boat and went off somewhere with his disciples to another place. And the people who heard it and listened to him were left to discuss it, to do some midrash work. I don't know exactly what that parable means. That was just my interpretation. But the best teachers, the greatest teachers, aren't the ones who give us the answers. The greatest teachers are the ones who make us think for ourselves. Maybe you had teachers like that in school who educate us. The Latin word educare, to draw out from within. That's what a teacher does. And they move us into ways of being in the world and toward ways of being that make the world a better place and make us be better human beings and hopefully part of that beloved community, the kingdom of heaven or the kingdom of righteousness, as Jesus calls it. And so maybe the first step is to empty ourselves of the old ways of being so that we can move into a new way of being. That's what we're called to do by Jesus, by the Buddha, and by all of the great teachers throughout the ages. This is our task. May it be so.
If you like this video, please like us on YouTube, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and click on the bell to be notified whenever we post a new video. Thank you.